Thanks a lot for joining us. We've got a panel of three interesting people plus me to talk about the Apple car, or what the Apple car might be and what it might tell us about the future of the car industry. So it would be helpful first if you could just each introduce yourself, just in the order I have you on my screen. So Andrew, sort of briefly, who you are and what you bring to this.
Absolutely. I'm Andy Hart. I'm the CEO of SPD Automotive, and we're a market research and consultancy firm, particularly focused around connectivity, autonomy, shared mobility, and electrification.
Great. And Dan?
I'm Dan Levy. I'm the Senior Equity Research Analyst at Credit Suisse. I cover the automakers and tier one auto suppliers, so names like Ford, GM, Tesla, as well as companies such as Aptiv, Lear, and Magna. And my focus is on both the cyclical movements of the industry as well as the longer term mega trends and the confluence between these trends.
Great. And Carla?
Hi, everyone. I'm Carla Balo. I'm the CEO for the Center of Automotive Research. We are an independent nonprofit think tank who does research to promote the sustainability of the automotive and mobility industry. Everything from smart cities, smart vehicles, smart manufacturing, and also all the economics that surround and the business cases that are so important for mobility solutions.
Right, and I'm Benedict Evans. I've done various things. At the moment I'm an independent analyst. Previously, I worked in venture capital, investing in software companies, and in strategy at media and telecoms companies. And once upon a time, I was an equity analyst covering mobile operators back when they were sexy, exciting, dynamic growth companies. Then they turned into water companies, which is also kind of a cautionary tale for some of us. And so the topic of the conversation here is to talk about the Apple car. And so there's a sort of there's a framing that the industry is clearly shifting to electric, may shift to autonomy, but there's a lot of debate as to how and when that will happen. And indeed, some people would say if that would happen. And then there's a lot of debate about how that enables new entrants into the car industry. And a parallel lots of people love to go to is that Apple, as a computer company, got into the phone business and messed everybody up and drove everybody out of business, or almost everybody who was in it ended up leaving. And so I had like a kind of a list of questions, but really this is just going to be like a free-form conversation. I suppose like the first question is that actually making a car is a big, heavy industry thing involving production lines and machinery and large pieces of metal in ways that have something in common with making phones, but not a huge amount. And the big difference is that electronics is actually a contract manufacturing model. So Apple doesn't have any factories. And so I'm curious what each of the panelists think about how we might move to a model in which, particularly as we go to electric and then maybe to autonomy, that the technology part becomes separate from the manufacturing part, which becomes separate from the assembly part. So for example, in an iPhone, like they're assembled in China, but like 95% of the value doesn't come from China. And then the components are designed by Apple or Samsung or someone else. And so I'm just curious, as a sort of a tech person, how does the panel think about where the car industry might go?
I think that's a really interesting question, because in the legacy automakers, let's say, you always design for manufacturing, and it's done from the very beginning. And you have a plethora of models with many different kinds of design and styling lines. It's a lot different from a phone, we'll put it that way, in terms of manufacturing. But we're starting to see many disruptors start to enter the industry as we think of cars as commodities, and as we think of them more as personal mobility devices, and getting many different use cases. So already we've seen a lot of contract manufacturing, and many of the new electric vehicle companies coming into the segment are actually looking at contract manufacturing, because it's a very expensive proposition to think about manufacturing a vehicle. And then as we look at commonization of skateboard platforms for EVs with just different top hats, again, that gives you more flexibility. And even you've got companies now like Arrival that are coming in and saying they're going to have microfactories and just robots that, you know, can be programmed. So it's a whole new world that's opening up.
I think when you're starting with nothing, it's a lot easier to look at kind of all of those different options and come up with a blank sheet of paper that makes sense given the volumes you're likely to enter any kind of market at. And it simply doesn't make sense to set up the kind of factories that traditional vehicle manufacturers have, the way that they've set it up. I think, you know, as your volumes grow, then you start to reconsider what do you contract out and what do you keep in-house. But I think even for traditional vehicle manufacturers, in terms of the IP that you talked about of what's made in the US versus what's made in China, I think more vehicle manufacturers are now realizing that they've over-relied on their tier one suppliers too much, and they're trying to rein some of that back in and retake control over certain parts of the stack, like the software layer.
I think what you're seeing is somewhat of a shift in the model. Obviously, we went from a model where automakers were really defining themselves on powertrain and their manufacturing base. And clearly you've seen that the key elements that are emphasized by automakers today are a combination of software and the onset of electrification. I wouldn't shortchange the importance of manufacturing, and I think you're seeing this interesting two-tier dynamic of, on one hand, you have the rise of a number of startups, and certainly contract manufacturing is giving them a way to enter the market in a de-risked fashion. But what you're also seeing is amongst the, and I don't mean to steal your thunder for what may be a later question, is you're also seeing the onset of large automakers sort of consolidating, capabilities, and Tesla is an interesting example of the importance actually of, that there could be some benefit to having your own capacity, right? Because the old automotive model was, the more you insource, the more that there's, vertical integration, and it varies in terms of model, the more there's opportunity to take advantage of your, to control your path of growth and to scale up. And that's what Tesla is doing. So you're seeing this two-tier, approach where startups are able to enter the market now. There is contract manufacturing, but I wouldn't necessarily shortchange the importance of having some of your own manufacturing capacity to control your own destiny.
I think it's also worth looking at some of the startup OEMs that have withdrawn. And I know they're not quite a startup OEM, but Dyson's a good example of an OEM that, with deep pockets, looked at even contract manufacturing. It's a range of different models and said, we just can't make the numbers work. I think SPACs can make anything work to some extent. The glory of free money is you don't have to worry about profits in the short term. But if you look at kind of established companies looking at the automotive market, the numbers are really hard to justify in their traditional mindset. And I'm sure Apple have looked at the same numbers and thought, oh, that's hard work to make money out of that kind of sector.
I mean, the key thing that changed in the phone business, and this is an interesting analogy, but a very limited one. The key thing that changed was sort of 20 years ago, if you wanted to make a phone, you kind of needed to be making the base stations and to have invented GSM. And so you kind of needed to have the whole stack. And that got unbundled. So the cellular radio chips came from a different company and the CPU came from a different company. And so today, 15 years after the iPhone, Apple makes everything inside the iPhone. But at the time, they were buying all of that in. And then they were paying contract manufacturers to put it together for them. And so I think that it sort of kind of merges with, I suppose, what was my second question is, how much do we think there's going to be sort of fundamental differentiation in the battery and the rest of the skateboard, as opposed to what goes on top of it? Because, obviously historically there was the transmission system and the engine and the noise it made when you press the button, when you press the pedal. And part of the point of electric is there's no moving parts and it's just a motor. And so, as an outsider, I kind of look at this and think, well, is it that Tesla's going to have 20% better range for the next 10 years and that will matter for some cars and not for other cars? But basically all of this is going to be the same? Or is there going to be kind of really differentiation in the EV platform that's different and that's noticeable to a consumer?
I'll kick off there. And I think, over time, think about what's distinguishable to a consumer, right? Consumers see basically a few basic things. They want to know what they're paying. They want to know what the range of the vehicle is, what the operation, what the performance is, and then obviously the interior. So I think the answer is that at some point in the future, however far distant that may be, electrification may not necessarily be very differentiated, which is sort of interesting because if you look at all of these automakers, think about their names: Ford Motor Company, General Motors, Toyota Motor Company. Actually, it used to be Tesla Motors, and now I think the Motors was eliminated from their name a long time ago. So I think over time, there won't be as much differentiation because this is not what matters to the consumer. However, you can see that all of the efforts of automakers to invest in this shift to electrification, both the legacy companies as well as any of these startups, is because there are still significant barriers to entry. There is still a first mover advantage for the company that can get there first in terms of capability, in terms of price points, etc. And all of that tells you that there is opportunity to take share as the market shifts. And I think that's what's at play here. So while maybe in the very long term, the electric, the skateboard or the batteries are not going to be differentiated, consumers won't care, and at some point it will be commoditized, however far out that may be. For the time being, this is a point of differentiation, and it is a point to establish yourself in the new EV world to make sure you have those capabilities and to have that first move advantage and to capture that share.
Yeah, my view is a little bit different. I don't think the customer cares at all what's under their hood, even today. Most customers don't look under the hood. It's all about the experience. Less than 25% of people even test drive a car anymore. It's making sure their phone can connect, making sure, the car can be, a place where they can get stuff done. It's really, really the automakers and the newcomers really need to focus on meeting the customer's expectations. And yes, right now, leadership and this fight of who has the best battery is ongoing, but I don't think the customer is going to care in the long run. They want X amount of range, they want X amount of durability, and they're not going to care if it's an LG, an SK, or a Panasonic, or whatever newcomer comes into the space. And when we think about skateboards and complexity, skateboard models need to be harmonized as much as possible to get the economies of scale where they need to be, and then put the different types of top hats. Now, they may have a different skateboard for the luxury model versus a standard model, and they may have different battery sizes that have different performances and keep the price down. But in general, the customer is going to be king, and you have to meet what their expectation is, which is range and longevity.
I think I agree with Carl on that point. I think if you consider what Apple's going to be known for if they do launch a car, it's not going to be generally kind of what's under the hood. It's going to be everything they built on top and the way that they've integrated their broader ecosystem of Apple Pay, Apple Services, Apple Maps, everything into one seamless experience. That's what will really differentiate the experience. That's not to say, as Dan said, that there isn't short-term opportunity to have a better battery pack here or longer range there. But increasingly, it's going to be about everything that happens kind of above that layer.
I feel like I actually feel like I'd agree with everyone in that, like, in the end, it will all be the same. There's a difference between what you want from a $15,000 car and what you want from a $75,000 car. And if you're going to use the car to collect the kids from school and go to the supermarket, you don't really care what the range is because you're going to charge it every night. You're never going to go more than 50 miles in a day anyway. Whereas if you're buying the 7 Series or the Mercedes, then you probably do. I mean, where I was sort of getting to that is, and we haven't really talked about Apple specifically, is this sense of like, how hard is it going to be for them to get their dream car made? And the answer to that is, well, it sort of depends. And obviously there was a story of them working with Hyundai. And Hyundai discovered that that Apple is a bit like Fight Club, in that the first rule of working with Apple is you don't talk about working with Apple. They actually used to sell a T-shirt at the company store that said, "I visited Apple in Cupertino, and that's all I'm allowed to say." But then the other side of that is, like, what is it that would be different about an Apple car? Because the way I sort of look at this is, like, I used to make fun of fantasies about Apple M&A, where people would say, "Oh, Apple will buy Boeing because they could make the seats in the airline better." And it was like, well, yes, maybe they could, but that's not what it is to make an airliner. And actually, Boeing doesn't make the seats anyway, which is a sort of separate point. And like Apple could make a Tesla, just as Dyson could make a Tesla. And it might be nicer than the Tesla. But I suppose the question is, would they do that? Or is there scope for them something to do something fundamentally different and better? And if so, is that something to do with this sort of question of when the car is semi-autonomous? Because the big argument about the Tesla is they say it's autonomous, it's not, you're not quite sure when it's autonomous and when it is and when it isn't. And that feels like a sort of a software user experience question, which is the kind of thing Apple loves. Whereas if Apple thought, well, we could make better door handles than Tesla or BMW, they probably wouldn't go there. For the same reason they wouldn't make an airliner. Like, that's not what they do. It would have to be something where they felt there was something about the software experience, that there was a problem that people weren't answering in the right way. And so I'm just kind of curious, as you kind of look at the we have sort of three car people, as you look at the way the car industry is shifting from an ICE with a manual gear stick to a car where you basically just got a go button, how much scope there is to answer that question in a kind of a completely different way.
I think just to kind of get the conversation started on that one, I think there is a shift in the language within the industry. As cars become more autonomous and there's more free time, it's going to be about engagement and who owns the person's attention in the car ultimately. But I don't think Apple needs autonomy to build something disruptive within this industry. I think if you look at kind of all of the assets that Apple already has today, many of which Tesla doesn't have, they've got enough to build something that's quite a lot more powerful than what Tesla can deliver. I think where Tesla's built out their walled garden, it's very much around the EV experience and around the kind of charging experience. And yes, they have got a nice in-car experience with their display, but it really is kind of amateur level compared to what big players like Apple can deliver. If you look at the digital services, personal ID experience, if you look at the virtual assistant experience, the App Store experience, the payment experience, it's all, it's all there. The only thing that's missing ultimately is the car. And I think that's where the differentiation comes. And that's where the ability to offer something that Tesla simply can't do today comes from.
Address the question of what they could be doing, just a point of perspective. Apple this year, or as my colleague who covers Apple would say, this is a company that's going to generate in excess of 350 billion of revenue. By 2023, in excess of 350 billion of revenue, almost $90 billion of operating income. So just to frame what Apple could or could not be doing, I think a first place of saying is they want to move the needle. And when you're dealing with 350 billion of revenue, 90 billion of operating income, offering just a one-off service, something like an Apple CarPlay, is not enough to move the revenue. So that, I think, helps frame why, we know they're doing something. We don't know what they're doing, but why the $2 trillion plus automotive market is something they're trying to address. Now, what they can do differently, or their approach, has typically been around solving pain points. It's using their hardware, software, services stack to solve pain points. And I think the biggest pain point right now there's two very large pain points. One is electrification. The other is software. I think the more compelling approach here is what Apple can do on software, which is we've seen legacy automakers struggle with this shift to software. It requires a new architecture. It requires a complete change in the way that they're doing things. Obviously, they're working on this. I think there's very good progress, but that's what Apple brings to the table. It's solving this software pain point and decoupling hardware from software so that the vehicle can improve. And this is maybe where I draw a similarity with Tesla has done. Really, just Tesla using OTA to improve the functionality of the vehicle is something that we haven't seen others do yet, although they're obviously embracing that.
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree this time. And when we think about what Apple can do and has done in terms of the monetization of data, data is ruling the car industry and the mobility industry in the world. That's supposed to be $2.1 billion there, I think. I've forgotten the exact number in terms of data monetization. And Apple is great at that. I mean, look what they do with all the different services that they provide, and they do it seamlessly. And consumers just continue to go on with that. And, automakers simply aren't good at that, nor do they have the human capital today or the background and experience. So I would be very afraid of what Apple can bring. Now, the other side of the coin is nobody knows because they're so silent. All of my friends who left to go to Apple, they say, I'm sorry, but you're not going to be able to talk to me anymore. That's it. So we don't know, but we do know that they're kings of data management and data integration and ease of, improving life for people. And this is where the industry's headed.
I mean, this, so I was going to say, I mean, this integration thing is interesting because, I mean, there's this great line that you can see the org chart of a car company in the dashboard, and that you can see that the gear stick team hate the steering wheel team and don't talk to the HVAC people. And there's, the sort of, I can't remember who it was, that somebody said to me that what's happening is the car industry is going from complicated cars with simple software to simple cars with complicated software. And that's, sort of a fundamental shift in how you think about what you're putting together. It's also, frankly, an org chart question, because, you actually have people whose job is to buy this component and a whole other team whose job is to buy that other component. And when you turn it all into software, that's not 5 different teams anymore. That's just an application that runs on the computer. I mean, this is the thing that we saw, with all the quotes when Apple came into market against BlackBerry. Is the only sensible thing Mike Lazaridis said was, my God, if this thing is real, we're not competing with a phone, we're competing with a Mac. Because that wasn't what they were making. They were making a phone. And with a whole bunch of presumptions around what you could do on a phone in the late 90s. And then suddenly they're competing with actually not a phone that had touch screen, but with a very, very small computer. And that, it's almost more than learning the technology. It's sort of changing your whole org structure and your whole kind of culture of what it is that you're trying to build that was so difficult for everybody else to compete with.
I think it's also the way you think, because Apple has the ability to provide something that nobody realized really they were missing. And, the automotive companies, we often just tend to look model over model improvements. We listen to focus groups, et cetera. Now, Tesla doesn't listen to focus groups. They're the outlier here. But this is the way it traditionally is done. And if you're waiting for the consumer to tell you, you're already behind what an electronics company can do, what a tech company can do. So how to change that thought, how to change the hesitancy towards risk, I think these are some of the biggest challenges that the legacy automakers are going to face. And one of the things that, the Apples, even Waymo and Google are going to bring in that's just going to shock the industry.
How much do you think you're going to see sort of single unified autonomy projects across many companies? Like everyone will either be using the Waymo thing or the Toyota thing.
That's going to be a while, quite frankly. Everybody right now is using different technology, different algorithms, different sensing devices. And right now it's their secret sauce. It's what they believe is going to drive the future to autonomy. Now, over time, and once we get better regulations and better policies, those brain waves may start to connect and we might see more collaborations. I think you will see partnerships because it's very, very expensive work. So some automakers are just going to say, I'm not getting into it. You've seen already automakers that have dropped out of mobility services. We're done. We're done spending money there because we're not good at it. I think you will see some automakers do that, much more collaboration. But I think it'll be a while till we have all similar ways of thinking, because if you do that, you're going to start to lose some of your personality and that integration into the valet services that the consumer is going to want.
I think the challenge with companies that are heavily focused on the kind of perception layer or the kind of autonomy layer is at some point they will also become commoditized. Believe it or not, it's hard to imagine right now given everything that's going on in the industry. At some point, you won't be able to sell a journey or sell a car by telling customers that we're less likely to kill you or less likely to get you in an accident. There's kind of a price of entry, which is don't kill your customers. And then, beyond that, it's about the experience. And so it's kind of interesting seeing Waymo kind of in this space because it's so closely coupled to a big player like Uber, who has a lot of the rest of the experience within there. It's how are they going to kind of bring together the autonomy with the lifestyle experience to be able to build something special. And I think there is benefits in having kind of both. But I feel, seeing players like Lyft kind of take a step back from trying to build the autonomy, I think they're starting to question themselves, do we need to own this? Or can we just accept that we'll buy it in, it's not going to kill our customers, and we'll build everything else on top of it?
I think that the dynamic, Andrew, that you point to, that a number of players have stepped back. I think this just gets to how much more difficult a problem to solve autonomy is, and that we're still emerging from this trough of disillusionment and I think really the event that sort of entered us into the trough of disillusionment several years ago was the Uber accident. And I think we've started to emerge from that. But along the way, there's been a reset, right? You see Zoox basically having to go out and having to sell itself, and Uber, selling ATG, and obviously, Zoox you mentioned. I think what you're seeing, though, is at the same time in parallel, while maybe just like batteries, at the end of the day, no one will care what autonomous system you're using as long as it works. But there is a first mover advantage, and especially as you could see some of the earlier use cases on more advanced forms of autonomy, level 4, are being done on a city by city basis, which really requires sort of staking your turf, figuring out the city, getting the maps in order. That requires a first mover advantage. So while long term there may not be much differentiation, as we emerge from this trough of disillusionment, and as a number of players are sort of retrenching and solidifying their strength, the Waymos and Cruises and Argos, et cetera, you are still seeing significant efforts on those parts.
One of the things that I see through talking to people in autonomy is that it seems to be much more a question of where than when. So you'll have the garbage truck that can follow the crew down the street at walking pace, and at the end of the road, the crew get in and drive it. Or you have a golf cart that can drive around a city centre with a park and ride system with no manually driven cars allowed. At the edge of the city centre, you get back into your manually driven car. And so it's, you won't have a car that can drive from San Francisco to Houston to South Boston. And we're not waiting for that. We'll have lots of other things that can do something simpler along the way. The puzzle I have, with sort of notionally talking about Apple specifically, is like a car that doesn't have autonomy and is just electric. Well, that's kind of just a better Tesla, and there's not that much for Apple to do. Whereas a car that doesn't have a steering wheel and you just get into it and say, take me home, again, there's no interface. So there's no problem for Apple to solve. In the former example, this is another interesting question, that might be made by GM, it might be made by Kawasaki, it might be made by whoever it is that makes the trucks for the post office. At the other side, the autonomy is coming from Waymo, and you don't know, or you don't care, and you get this kind of, it seems to me, almost paradoxically, the advantage for Apple is sort of in the middle ground, where it works but doesn't work perfectly, because that's where they can smooth it over and solve the pain points. Once it just works, and you get in and the car's got a range of 10,000 miles and never crashes, that's actually not Apple anymore, because they're not solving that pain.
I think you're right to point out pains with this transition, because we talk about level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. It's actually a lot messier than that. We've mapped out around 200 capabilities between kind of level 1 and level 4. And that can be anything from, handling certain types of maneuvers to handling certain types of roads. I'm amazed in the US, Carla, how many crazy intersections exist in terms of the right or the Pittsburgh left or the Texas double U-turn. Each one of those needs to be very carefully thought out.
The Israeli middle finger,
It's on its own, and I think that complexity is going to be an absolute nightmare to communicate to customers. And I can understand to some extent why Elon Musk has simplified it down for his customers. I think he's oversimplified it too far. But customers can't be expected to know when, where, how, why, what, when it comes to autonomy. And I think that's going to be a big problem to solve. I don't think Apple can solve that on their own. I think that's a kind of industry-wide challenge that we need to face. And if we don't manage it ourselves, governments are going to step in with a heavy hand and try and fix it for us.
Yeah, I think where Apple is going to have the biggest value is, again, that user experience, making everything seamless. We don't want everybody, especially in very urban congested areas, to continue driving their own personal vehicle, be it electric or not. We want them to start using some sort of a shared service. And in that case, to be able to understand the type of vehicle I want, to have it programmed to the type of music I want because I slept a certain way last night, you know, to understand where I like to eat and make sure and ask if I want to go there. I mean, this is where Apple is going to excel. And this, quite frankly, in the world of mobility services is where money is to be made.
I think I would just tack on to that, you know, one of the things they've done really well is the services offering, which you see a lot of other automakers trying to enter and really trying to access these ancillary revenue streams. I think in an extreme autonomous use case, you could maybe ask the question of how much of that services stream is available, how much of that, you know, third-party app ecosystem can be woven in versus, I think what you're saying is this middle ground of where, you know, there's some functionality, but not a fully autonomous, you know, robo-taxi with no steering wheel, full level 5, as, you know, as has been said before. So.
I think between where we are today of just basically CarPlay and a full Apple car, there's a spectrum of other ways in which Apple can play an influential role within the industry. And Apple Services, Dan, I think is a very good example of that. We're kind of partnering with different OEMs to get Apple Music in there natively can create a lot of value, not talking about $1 trillion worth of value, but certainly kind of value where Apple can get to more listeners, get to more users, get to more customers. I think that's where we see a lot of short-term opportunity.
So I think we're now out of time. I mean, this is really fascinating. One of the things that often occurs to me is that this is sort of the intersection of the car industry and the tech industry. And no one in the tech industry really understands how cars work. And no one in the car industry really understands how the tech industry works either. And so you've got this kind of collision of these two industries. There is another example, which is worth pointing out, which is that when Apple launched the iPhone in 2007, at the same event, they also announced an event called the Apple TV, which Steve Jobs thought had cracked it and he was going to break open the TV industry. And of course, that just didn't happen at all. And the tech industry, the TV industry has been swallowed by software, but it's controlled by TV companies. It's not controlled by software companies. Google, Apple, Facebook are nowhere. Amazon's bought its way in, but you know, that's not a world where Apple is ruling. And so there is always that counterfactual that, you know, this stuff always gets changed by tech, but you can't always predict, like, just because Apple's there, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win. But I think we will probably watch this video in about 10 years' time and be really entertained by which bits we got right and which bits we didn't. For that, I will say thank you, and we'll hand back to our organizers.